In this course, we're going to be looking at a number of important places around the city of Rome. We're going to consider them with respect to their site, where they are, what happens on that site, what's happened historically, what happens today, and how the architecture and the urbanism responds to the site, to the history of the site, to its meaning, and also to the program of the buildings that find themselves on the site. We're interested in how the buildings convey meaning, and we're interested in what those meanings actually are. Here we are in the Capitoline Hill, the political center of the city of Rome. Historically, the Capitoline overlooked the Roman Forum, the old political center of the city of Rome, of the ancient city. The city of Rome was founded and it was developed early in its history as a republic. It was a representative government, and it depended, therefore, on the meeting of its citizens in a communal space to discuss their agendas and their future. That space of gathering, therefore, was essential to the idea of Rome. It was essential to the idea that Rome was a community of people, sort of all working towards the same end. They would debate there, they would vote there. So the Forum was a symbolic center of the political idea of Rome. Now, while over the centuries it accrued many new buildings, basilicas, temples, markers like columns, triumphal arches even later in the Roman Empire, it always reserved that sense in which it was an open space, a kind of reserved, special place where Rome, even when it stopped being essentially a representative government and had become an empire, still preserved that idea that it was a community. The Romans actually believed that the umbilicus mundi, the navel of the world, had been moved from Delphi in Greece to the Roman Forum. And so for Rome, it wasn't just the sense that this was the center of Rome, this was the center of the world in the Roman Forum. Now, as those buildings grew up over time and the Forum was transformed because of what surrounded it, the city of Rome also grew and changed and became part of the center of a vast empire. And the Roman citizens and the Roman population grew enormously, to almost 1 million people, perhaps more. And those people all lived, again, behind the Forum, behind me, on the hills surrounding it, because it was actually supposed to be healthier to be up on the hills. But the hills actually depended on aqueducts for water. They didn't have a lot of natural water supply. And so in order for those hills to be habitable, they had to be served by aqueducts bringing water in from all over the Roman Campagna, the Roman countryside. When the city of Rome was attacked and sacked near the end of the Roman Empire, those aqueducts were cut either by the people attacking to cut off the water supply, or by the defenders to prevent attackers coming into the city through the aqueducts. And so when the population lost that water supply, and through a whole series of other depredations, they moved to another part of Rome, the area known as the Campus Martius, which was the field of Mars, where the Roman early empire, even late republic, had practiced their military exercises on a plain in the bend of the Tiber River. That area of the Campus Martius eventually itself acquired many important monumental buildings, but very few people lived there in the ancient city. But when the empire collapsed, when the aqueducts were cut, and when the population shrank, people moved into that area of the Campus Martius and took over essentially that bend in the Tiber River, which became known as the abitato, the inhabited part of the city of Rome, partly because it was also near the papacy and whatever was left of power and authority in the center of Rome. The Roman Forum, therefore, political center of the ancient city of Rome, but soon lost its role as that political center when the population shifted after the fall of the Roman Empire. Now we're on the Capitoline Hill, one of the 7 hills of Rome, and one of the most important of the city. Mythically, before Rome was founded, the god Saturn had founded a city on this hill. He had founded the city in the ancient days before really history was even written about the city of Rome. And he had a rival city founded by the Etruscan god Janus on the Janiculum Hill. And we'll visit that hill after this section of the course to look at the Tempietto. So 2 ancient mythical cities happen on 2 hills. Saturn has his city on this hill, the Capitoline Hill, and Janus has his on the Janiculum Hill. The Capitoline, capital, is where we get our word capital, actually. And it always has meant that center that, symbolically at least, it was a kind of acropolis, a kind of symbolic political center, the practical political center being down in the Roman Forum, but the symbolic center of Rome being up here on the Capitoline Hill. The high point in the hill was known as the Arx, and it was the place where there was a citadel, the most defensible part of the city. When all else was lost, the Romans retreated to the Arx, or the citadel, up on the high point of the Capitoline Hill, here to my right. There were also temples on this hill, and towards the Roman Forum, there was an enormous building that essentially functioned like a retaining wall. That was the tabularium, the archives building of ancient Rome, where all their records were kept. Below the tabularium at the edge of the forum were a series of temples, the most ancient of which was the Temple of Saturn, dedicated to the god who had founded his city here on the Capitoline Hill. And the Temple of Saturn, in its understructure, was also the treasury of Rome, where they kept their most precious treasures. So there are many ways in which this hill and its symbolic mythical history was associated with the political center of Rome, even though it was removed from it. In a way, it was kind of like an acropolis, like the Acropolis in Athens. Now, with the fall of the Roman Empire, the cutting of the aqueducts, the shrinking of the population, the Roman Forum essentially became abandoned, eventually taken over by Roman citizens, partly lived in, but in many ways cannibalized for raw material to either burn in lime kilns to make lime, or to build new buildings out of the spoliae or fragments that came from the Forum. Eventually, the Forum became known as the Campo Vaccino, the cow pasture. Because cows grazed there, it was essentially a field with ruins, but also because cows were driven in from the south of Italy and the countryside south of Rome to be brought here to market near the Capitoline Hill. And there were in fact butchers all collected around this hill, and some of the people in authority here on the Capitoline Hill were in fact the butchers' guilds. Capitoline itself, because the city of Rome had been oriented now in the Middle Ages away from that ancient Roman city, towards that bend in the Tiber towards the northwest, the Capitoline Hill reoriented itself beginning in the Middle Ages towards that new center of Rome. And on top of the tabularium, which essentially had sat sort of almost below the level of the Capitoline Hill, the medieval Roman governors and rulers of the city built their Palazzo Senatorio, the senator's palace. Singular senator. There was one senator in medieval Rome who was effectively the mayor of the city, as opposed to the deliberative body of the Senate for ancient Rome in the Curia. They built a building that was as much a kind of defensive outpost as it was a political center. It was a place for meetings, but it was also a place to retreat to when things got tough. And lots changed over the history of medieval Rome. It was a very contentious landscape between the papacy, between private warring baronial families. And so this effectively almost castle-like building that became the mayor's residence and the mayor's political seat was essentially a kind of castle atop of the hill, another kind of arx or defensive citadel. It was also the place, though, where deliberation happened. And there was a gradual ramp step that led up to the piano nobile, our second floor for Americans, or the European first floor. And that level was the place at which there was the ceremonial spaces of the building. And there was a ramp descent up there to make it easy even for horses to ascend up to it. Adjacent to it, on one side here, began to be built the Palazzo dei Conservatori. The conservators were a kind of city council, if you like, a deliberative body who essentially worked with the senator to govern Rome, to keep control over its streets and how the city was actually organized and functioning. And many of the guilds of Rome, those collections of professional bodies of people that corresponded to trades, like the butchers, for example, had their headquarters here at the Conservatori. But the space itself was rather loosely organized. It was rather shabby, in fact. It was not paved. There was no clear way to get up here. There was no grand ascent up to this point of the city. In fact, the papal possessor route, the route that the popes took to go from St. Peter's to the Lateran to take possession of their seat as Bishop of Rome, typically through the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance, avoided the Capitoline Hill because it was rather disheveled and there was no easy way up here. So when the Emperor Charles V comes here for his triumphal procession after having won a great naval battle, he actually avoids the Capitoline Hill, moves around it, and processes through the triumphal arches in the Roman Forum down to the Colosseum. That's the situation, essentially, when Michelangelo comes on the scene and redesigns the piazza for Pope Paul III. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, is that sense in which the space was designed, actually given a precise form that refers to the history of the site, the history of the Roman Forum, but also reorients the space to the new modern city of Rome.